I'd like to welcome you all back once more to a very special kind of essay where we briefly examine the novel tie-ins to the Dragon Age series. Thank you so much to everyone who has watched these, as fantasy literature is my truest passion, and this has been a wonderful way to spread my love for the genre. If you aren't quite caught up with us, I have brief essays examining the highlights and themes of the previous two novels in the series, The Stolen Throne and The Calling, both also by David Gaider. This is a bittersweet moment, as for the time being, it not only marks near the end of our exploration of material relating to Dragon Age Inquisition, the game that picks up where this novel leaves off, it also leaves us considering the final of Gaider's 3 contributions to the novel tie-ins, and it turns out Asunder was his best yet. Knowing that Gaider left the team feels bittersweet, since there's a lot of great stuff we haven't talked about yet, but we're nearing the end of his place in the timeline in the creation of Dragon Age, so it feels like saying goodbye in an odd way. In the past, I've described Gaider's style in terms of something resembling pulp fiction schlock, where the contents of his stories tend to be a broad dive into the human spirit and its attendant struggles. This isn't at all an unpleasant quality, both of those two dynamics coexisting together, since it makes for easy reading, and is also likely within the realm of the expected, where fans of the video game series are concerned. Much of the video game is visual, however, so when the written word bears the weight of the world and all that's built within it, there's a consequential change in flavor, and at this point in my adventures through these books, Gaider's style felt familiar, at once comfortable as was likely intended, but also less likely to surprise, and therefore also somewhat less gripping, as the new and unseen is a draw of the genre. I wasn't sure I could really get into Asunder at first, and I have to admit that I spent the first few chapters nonplussed. I had predicted The Calling would be my favorite, and about a quarter of my way through the book, that seemed like it would remain the case. By the end, it no longer was. Asunder is my favorite of David Gaider's contributions to this series, and I think it's the mark of a rare writer that even when there's so much about their work that doesn't surprise you at all, they can still surprise you with something potent, something tender, something beautiful, or something strange. I think the turning point when this novel became my favorite, if there was a defining one, was Asunder's exploration of the character of Cole when the party are trapped in the Fade. "What are you looking for?" Rhys asked again, annoyed. And then she opened the last cabinet. Inside crouched a filthy young boy, perhaps 12 years in age, and with shaggy blonde hair hanging in front of his eyes. His face was filled with stark terror, wide eyes having long drained of tears that now stained his cheeks, and worst of all, a little girl was squeezed in there with him. She was half his age, held in a crushing grip, with one hand clamped over her mouth, as if to keep her quiet. Only she was dead. The young boy began shaking, fighting sobs that threatened to overwhelm him. "Please don't tell," he begged Evangeline, in a quivering whisper. "Mama told us to hide. We have to hide." "Cole?" Rhys approached behind her, horrified. Evangeline didn't know what to do. The little boy shook even more profusely, new tears welling in his eyes, but he made not a single sound. She wasn't sure he even knew who they were, or who he was. She reached out and removed Cole's hand from the little girl's mouth. "Bunny was crying," he explained in a tiny voice. "Mama told us to be quiet. I only wanted her to be quiet." It took me longer than I would have liked to figure out what Gaider was doing with this book, but as things stand, I think it's among his crowning achievements with Dragon Age, standing firmly next to his work on the games that means so much to all of us. Cole is an oddity, not quite person and not quite spirit, but a little bit of both, and on his own journey of self-discovery. This rescue by the Templar Evangeline and the Mage Rhys in the Fade is one of a number of moments that bring the two of them together, but it also sketches out why Cole is so important to the themes of Asunder and of Inquisition as well. Running through this book and that game are provocative themes of oppression and marginalization, not just of the elves, which we'll get to in our next look at another Dragon Age novel by another author, but also of mages and of groups they represent. Cole isn't just a spirit occupying the body of a mage, he was once a real child with real fear and suffering, and I think connecting that idea to the Mage and Templar conflict gives Gaider the opportunity to say a lot about this world, its contents, and how we might consider viewing it all. People from marginalized backgrounds often make appeals, or usually have appeals made on their behalf, that fixate on this fundamental unfairness in being judged for the circumstances of one's birth. It's a consistent pop culture through line, from Mewtwo to Lady Gaga lyrics. However, it's often reductive, often poorly articulated, and often presented as the wrong kind of appeal. A person fighting for their humanity can't use an argument on the basis of their birth to appeal to the sense of fairness of a more privileged or powerful person without ceding some of the little power they have in the form of their identity, agency, and voice. To say, "I was born this way," as presumably many mages and Thetis could, is effectively to say, "It's not my fault I'm this way," but in the context of oppression and bigotry, of the marginalization itself, fault was never the issue. If mages need to assert their humanity, or the dwarf, elf, or Kunari equivalent, in Orlais and Ferelden, then presumably they also need the agency of recontextualizing their own existence without reference to an oppressive or comparatively privileged group. And I think the relationship between Rhys and Evangeline is a great way to explore that possibility. But it goes deeper than that. There's something fundamental about Cole's story, about the tragedy of a young child who didn't understand what he was or what he was doing, about his loss and grief, and the sense that not only did he do the wrong thing in failing to protect his mother, he also broke his promise to her in accidentally killing his sister. When the human Cole dies and the spirit Cole occupies his body as they fuse into a single identity, it's all in a moment of fear, forgotten in the dark, disempowered and suffering. And this image of the young Cole crying because there was nothing he could do is itself a reflection of that. It takes the Mage versus Templar conflict and makes it small, makes it personal to the life of a child, and I think this approach turns that born this way narrative on its head. Now we're not talking about being just like someone else, we're talking about the suffering of mages on the terms of the mages, and the consequences the mages have to live with. Cole lives with those consequences as an invisible spirit forgotten by society, a symbol of the lost and invisible among us. But he has his foil in Wynne, a character not from Inquisition but from Origins, who makes a key appearance in this conflict as Rhys's own mother. Unlike Cole's loss and trauma, Rhys endures something quite different, because Wynne reasserts herself as his parent and chooses not to fail him or forget him. In the end, she makes the ultimate sacrifice for his happiness. He reached her body and pulled it up out of the water. It took all his strength. There he cradled her in his arms, wiping the wet locks of hair from her bloody face. She seemed almost peaceful, her eyes staring off into some distant place. "No, no, no, no," he repeated, the grief spilling out of him freely now. He didn't want her to go, he wanted her back. Rhys reached into himself, pulled up what little mana he possessed. He shook from the pain of it, and what came was pitifully little, but he poured whatever he had into Evangeline's body. He knitted flesh with healing magic, closed her wounds with healing magic, but it did nothing. She remained pale and lifeless. A hand gently touched his shoulder. "Rhys," Wynne's voice ached with pity. "It's too late. You can't." He shook his head, almost incoherent in his grief. "She's the best of them. She doesn't deserve this. The Maker can't take her from me now." He laid his head on Evangeline's breast, sobbing and praying silently for death to come for him too. He'd lost Cole, lost Evangeline, lost everything. All he'd wanted to do was help, but instead he'd destroyed it all. Wynne brushed his hair with her hand. It was an affectionate gesture, and when he looked up, he saw there were compassionate tears in her eyes. He was reminded of the woman he'd met so long ago, that hero of the Blight who had walked into the White Spire with a warm smile and an open heart, the one he'd felt so proud to call his mother. "Let me," she whispered. "But you can't, she's—" "Shush." Wynne put her hand over his lips to quiet him. Then she cupped his cheek lovingly, yet there was sadness and regret in her eyes. "I never knew why the spirit kept me alive when I should have died all those years ago. Now I do." Wynne turned her attention to Evangeline. She placed both her hands on the body and closed her eyes. There was a rush of power. Rhys didn't know quite how to describe it. It expanded out of Wynne, filling the sewer tunnel with its warm light, and he watched in amazement as something flowed out of her and into Evangeline. It wasn't dark or terrible. It was life. It was a spark. I think this passage really ties the earlier narrative beats, where Wynne is more of a reformist pulling against the libertarians or more revolutionary mages, in with the romance between Rhys and Evangeline, and the thread of Cole's backstory and ongoing invisibility to the world. Where Cole's invisibility and persecution represent a kind of trauma with his upbringing and a lack of a secure place in the world, Wynne's sacrifice for Rhys has an ongoing thematic context in terms of her accountability to her son. As an alternative presentation of a possessed mage, she's a foil to Cole in one sense, but in another sense that's what Cole is to Rhys. Cole recedes into the background, operating where he can, but not necessarily defying his status as someone whose personhood is erased, whereas Rhys increasingly becomes an active agent in the story, standing up for what he thinks is right. Rhys doesn't quite come to the same beliefs as his mother, but neither does he exactly fall in with the other mages in the story. His arc also represents a kind of push to self-actualize, but where Cole is a character whose fulfillment is in question at the end of the narrative, setting him up for his growth in Inquisition, Rhys's growth in the narrative sets both him and Evangeline up to be part of the creation of the Conclave, whose destruction is the inciting incident of the narrative of that same game. It's fitting, maybe, that like how Inquisition is where Flemeth parts ways with the player after appearing in all 3 games, Wynne finally lies down to die in Asunder. These are figures of legend being slowly left in the past as the world of Thedas undergoes its drastic changes. The social evolution of the cultures in Ferelden, Orlais, and beyond reach a turning point here, and sadly, this is near the end of David Gaider's tenure at BioWare. Asunder was published in 2011, just 3 years before the release of Inquisition. 2 years after that, Gaider would leave the company. I think this novel shows a profound amount of growth in the medium for being published just a couple years after his other 2, but on the other hand, it also presents to me as something deeper and more profound. A veteran writer's ever-thoughtful process in broaching deep topics which, regardless of whether the games industry was ready for them or not, laid the foundation for a hopeful future and gave something meaningful to everyone willing to take the time to sit down and just read a good book. If you give it a chance, you might find a little more of yourself in it than you expected. I know I did. Rhys and Evangeline watched quietly from a distance. He tried to remember his mother and that last smile she had given him. His heart ached, wondering at the life he might have had if she'd never been forced to give him away, the different life she might have had. Maybe they could have been good for each other. Liliana began to sing. The words were Elven, but Rhys understood them even so. They spoke of joy and loss, and how all things must come to an end. It was at once the most haunting and beautiful melody he'd ever heard.